back to that day?
Well, it seems a long time ago, but yet it doesn't. It was a day much like any other day. The only difference for us was that President George Bush was in town. So there was a lot of our resources that were spread thin as far as taxed with the presidential detail. I was in charge of the normal afternoon patrol operations, and really had just arrived to the office when the call came out. And the call was for an active shooter at Westroads Mall. Certainly there's nothing more desperate in law enforcement is when there's an active shooter. We know that every moment that goes by, every second that passes, that potentially additional lives will be maimed or killed, and so it's of the essence that we arrive there as quickly as possible to try to intervene and to neutralize the threat. That day, there were several other deputies at the office that heard the call, and we all rushed to our vehicles and drove as fast as we absolutely could. And I guess it's a testament of the grace of God that no officers were injured, that there was no accidents, because again, it's extreme haste trying to get to the call. And as I arrived at the Westroads Mall, I actually took Blondo Street from 156th and came around the backside by the dealerships. And as I arrived on, which would have been the west side of the mall by the food court, what immediately caught my attention was it wasn't as I envisioned. In law enforcement, we're trained when we're going to a hot call or a in-progress call that we try to visualize what we might see when we arrive, so we begin to formulate a plan. And so I certainly did that as well. As I arrived, I'm expecting mass pandemonium, people running and screaming from the mall. And I was really taken back because as I come around to get through the crosswalk of the food court, people were just kind of exiting the mall really nonchalantly. Again, it just took me by surprise, and you start questioning the information that you heard on the radio. That again, multiple victims, that an active shooter was in Westroads Mall. So as I parked my vehicle, I grabbed my shotgun and ran in, which would have been the west doors of the Von Maur store. And as soon as I entered again, expecting chaos, expecting everyone in panic, expecting yelling and screaming and gunshots, it was really surreal because as you enter there, it's where the cosmetic counters are. I saw no one, I really heard nothing. No one running and screaming, no one panicking and hiding at the moment. You hear the Christmas music, and it really puts you back on your heels, so to speak, as you begin to assess what you have and take in, certainly scan for threats. And it was then that, again, began to assess that there was evidence that someone had been shot at the base of the escalator. And then from that moment, additional resources were on their way. I realized at that point there was another Omaha officer that had arrived moments before me that was in the Von Maur store and had asked me to secure the store. They had information at the time, now we know was not correct information, but that the shooter possibly, or a shooter, had ran towards the JCPenney store. And so they asked me to secure the Von Maur, and I told them that I would. And after he had left, again, began just to take in my surroundings there. I'm on the first floor of Von Maur at the base of the up escalator, and just began to look around, again, not seeing anything, not hearing anything. And it was just a few moments later, the radio updated the information that there were multiple victims on the third floor that were asking for assistance. And so at that point, I made the decision as a law enforcement officer to do what I could to make it to the third floor. Now in law enforcement, we know that in years past, we were always trained to get to the scene, secure a perimeter, wait for specialized units, our SWAT teams to get there, and then let them do the tactical entry. Obviously, since Columbine, we know that that isn't a luxury, that it is of the essence to get there and to try to intervene as quickly as possible. And so what was going through my mind was I didn't feel that I had the luxury of waiting for backup, and so I made the decision to go up to the third floor as cautiously as I could. I knew that I had three things that none of those people on that third floor had. I had a weapon, I had body armor, and I had training. And so felt that I needed obviously to get there to, if there was a shooter still active on that third floor or still present, to try to intervene and to neutralize that threat. So as I began to go up the escalator, again, a thousand thoughts go through your head. You know, we're always trained in law enforcement to have the tactical advantage. And certainly going up the escalator in that wide open atrium of Von Maur, it's probably the worst case scenario, tactically speaking. So a thousand things go through your mind. You know, as through our training, we're trained, you know, to really scan for threats and be ready, you know, and to, if a threat presents itself, we react in the way that we're trained. And so as I'm going up the escalator, another key factor that really helped me that day, aside from my training, and probably most importantly, was my faith. You know, I have a background in ministry, and I serve as a chaplain and chaplain liaison with the sheriff's office. So that day as I'm going up the escalator, you know, I've been asked by numerous people, you know, if fear was present, you know, and sometimes people have this idea that law enforcement officers, you know, don't have any fear going into this. We do, because we're human. It's a natural reaction. However, we must put that fear aside and be able to react and to act despite that fear. So certainly that was it. But that day, you know, I prayed a prayer to God. God, help me on this day to do what needs to be done. Give me the courage. Give me the strength. Give me the fortitude to do what I have to do this day. I'll look to your strength. I'll look to your grace and your guidance. As I began to ascend there, I felt that even though physically I was not alone, you know, physically I was, but I knew that I was not alone, that it was the hand of God there helping me. And as I made it to the third floor, the ground zero of, you know, of the rampage that the shooter was engaged in, you see the carnage, you know, body after body. I made my way to the women's lounge, which was actually in the southwest corner of the third floor. At the time, and it's a regret that I live with to this day, that I did not have the information about the multiple victims behind the customer service, which would have been to my left and slightly behind me, because I actually went up the down escalator because it was turned off. So it would have went up facing to the south, and immediately to my right was the women's lounge. So again, you come across multiple victims, and made my way into the women's lounge, where several individuals were obviously you know, in a state of shock, and they were traumatized, understandably. One of those individuals was Jeff Schaffert, who had been shot through the bicep, and then multiple women were in there, you know, again, just in a state of trauma because of what had happened. And as they were rendering aid to Jeff, putting a necktie around his arm to control the bleeding, you know, Jeff turned to me and he pled with me to please go back out there because his wife was out there. Well, Miranda, to be honest with you, there was a couple females that I came across that were obviously deceased. Did not know that they were associates or customers, and certainly I feared the worst, because my fear was this gentleman's wife was out there, but certainly I didn't tell him that. I assured those individuals in the bathroom that backup was on its way, that I was not going to leave them, but I was going to step out to assess the floor there, see if I could locate any other victims, you know, that had a viable chance of surviving. And as I went back to that opening of the sales floor, just began to scan. And as I was scanning, again, 1,000 things go through your mind, because up until that moment, things happen so fast. You know, you just kind of are on autopilot. But at that moment, you begin to take in your surroundings and you start wondering the what ifs. You know, what if the shooter or multiple shooters present themselves? What's my plan going to be? But it was quiet. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. And after a few moments, I just, with a real kind of a lower voice, I just made an announcement, you know, that the sheriff, you know, I'm with the sheriff's office. I'm here to help. And just a very surreal scene as people began to roll out from underneath clothing racks. And obviously they didn't know who I was walking up there. In fact, one of those individuals that presented themselves when I made that announcement was Carrie Schaffert, Jeff's wife. And she later told the media that she saw my foot, you know, my shoes as I was walking towards the bathroom, not knowing that I was a first responder or the shooter. and certainly feared the worst as I was walking towards the bathroom where her husband was back in there. But I was able to gather them into the bathroom, and then finally was able to get on the radio. And as we see throughout the nation, whenever these active shooters, there's a lot of chaos going on. You know, even as law enforcement officers respond, you know, the radio channels are just clogged, and you can't key the mic to get any information out. And sadly, there's individuals that will give us inaccurate information, and certainly that was the case at Von Maur. There was some individuals who claimed that they saw a shooter or shooters run towards JCPenney, which proved not to be true. But the sad part about that is it diverted a lot of our resources, because at the time we have to act as if that's credible information. And so having the challenge of that inaccurate information and the amount of resources heading to the scene, again, makes it difficult to get on the radio. But when I was finally able to, I made the announcement that I was on the 3rd floor, that I had multiple victims and fatalities, and that I needed backup. And so it seemed like an eternity. You know, time kind of stands still. But going back over the radio traffic, between the time I made that announcement, it was about 6 minutes before the next officers came up onto the 3rd floor. And as we got more resources up there, we were able to fan out and to locate additional victims and survivors throughout the 3rd floor.
How, 8 years later, does it still sit with you?
It does. You know, you don't, the memory of that does not fade. The imagery that you saw that day will always be with you. But through time, okay, the human soul is able to begin to heal. And so the pain that was initially associated with that imagery that stays with you, it lessened, you know. And probably one of the most difficult parts of that for me, not only seeing that, but the next day when, the media began to announce the identities, and I began to hear the life stories behind each and every one of those victims. It just, it was very difficult, because it was tragic enough to see the carnage, and see the hate and the anger that the shooter enacted on these people that were defenseless, that were innocent, and they were selected because of those aspects. But to see that, how their lives were cut short for no reason other than hate was very difficult. But those memories stay with you. And since that day, I frequently go to the Von Maur to shop. Family members love to do that. And so I still remember. I still, unfortunately, remember where the victims were. Really didn't have, even after 8 years, had not gone to the 3rd floor much, because at the time most of the clothing up there is infants' clothing and other items that I generally don't shop for. But just recently, with the birth of my granddaughter, I had a reason to go up there. And you think that you've healed, and to be honest, when I stepped out on that 3rd floor, maybe it was a kind of a double factor that I was there, but also at the time I was holding my granddaughter, and just that feeling of vulnerability kind of come over you for a moment. And and that's how trauma is. Trauma is hard to predict.